Hello, I'm Fritz, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. And on behalf of my colleagues here at the Korbel School, let me say it's just our honor and privilege to host the Denver Democracy Summit. Over the past year, we were reminded just how fragile democracy is. Our founders, of course, knew this, but somehow we had forgotten. Democracy is hard. It's frustrating, it's contentious and messy. It demands a lot of our citizens, and it can be vulnerable to the mob, to the passions of the moment, and to the allure of the strong leader who promises to fix all. We meet at a pivotal moment for democracy. Around the world, we see the rise of authoritarian figures, the repression of dissent, ever greater sophistication in information control and restriction of the free press. And in this country, our dysfunctions have been on prominent display. Extreme partisanship, deep polarization, distrust of media, and weaponized disinformation led a disturbing fraction of the public to believe what is both patently untrue and profoundly threatening to democracy, the lie that the election was stolen. All that culminated on January 6th in the horrifying assault on the Capitol. And yet, America's democratic institutions prevailed. Americans voted in record numbers. Election officials did their jobs. And just hours after the assault, Congress solemnly certified the election. Once again, we saw the peaceful transfer of power. There's hope too in the awakening of civic engagement, including voices that have not been heard before, particularly heartening the engagement of young people. And while we may have to squint a little bit, there are hopeful signs around the world too. Activism on climate change and social justice, protests in Myanmar and India and Russia and elsewhere. The hunger for democracy has not disappeared. Over the next 2 days here at the summit, an extraordinary roster of speakers will be addressing both democracy's threats and its opportunities. Our hope is that we will all leave with greater awareness of the challenges, but equally important, a clearer vision of what we, each of us and together, can do to nurture, rebuild, and strengthen democratic institutions around the world and in this country. Thank you all for being with us. And again, welcome to the Denver Democracy Summit. And now, to set the stage for the summit, it is my great pleasure to be joined by Madeleine Albright, the 64th and first female U.S. Secretary of State, prolific author, professor, and of course, daughter of Joseph Korbel, our founder and namesake. And with her, Michael Abramowitz, president of Freedom House, an organization best known for its indispensable annual monitoring of the state of democracy and freedom around the world. Welcome, Madam Secretary. Welcome, Michael Abramowitz.
It's great to be with you, Dean Mayer, and to be part of this incredible conference. I'm delighted.
Great to see you, Fritz, and it's really an honor to also be with the Secretary, who's both a hero and a friend. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you both so much for being with us. Let me just jump right in. Let me just ask, what in your view is just the most important thing for our audience to know about the state of democracy around the world? Just how serious are the challenges? And let me start with you, Secretary Albright.
Well, thank you. And let me just say, in so many ways, Denver, for my parents, was the epitome of democracy, because we came there after democracy had been killed in the country there where we came from, Czechoslovakia, by the communists. And previously, it had been by the fascists. So my father talked endlessly about democracy. And he said, it is fragile, but also resilient. And I think we are seeing that as we look out at the whole scene. And it is fragile. And I think that that is the part that is of great concern, as Freedom House has done the measure in terms of what has been happening, because the forces that are out there, the divisions that are in many ways characteristic of every society, have been exacerbated by demagogic leaders who are taking advantage of that. And yet at the same time, democracy has the capability of correcting itself, of self-correction. And we're seeing that in a number of different places. And the question is how we can generally, the democratic countries can support those that would like to move into the democratic space, because I believe that, and I think this is basic, is that we all do want to have some kind of a role and decision-making process within the societies where we live, where our children go to school, what we have to say about the political scene. And I think that's what we need to know: fragility and resiliency. That is the lesson, I think.
Well, those are great themes somehow, and in some ways, the themes of this summit, I think. Michael, Freedom House, of course, annually reports on the state of affairs, and it's not been going well, I think. When you look out at the world, what do you see in terms of the trends?
Well, thank you, Fritz. I would say, first of all, that the situation is grim. And if you ask me, what people should pay attention to, that I think all of us, every citizen of the United States of the world, has to really put their shoulder into fighting this decline, which we've chronicled at Freedom House for the last 15 years. The survey that you referred to, Fritz, in your opening is called Freedom in the World. Every year, we look at every single country, including the United States, and we evaluate how those countries pay attention to political rights and civil liberties. And every year for the last 15 years or so, the survey shows that there are more countries that are experiencing declines in rights and freedoms than those that are experiencing improvements. And that is of great concern. I tend to be, I think, like Secretary Albright, a glass half full kind of person. I try to be optimistic, and there's a lot to be optimistic about. But I do think that we have to really recognize that we're in a very serious problem that is not just a human rights problem, but I think it's a national security challenge for the United States. Because if we live in a world in which many countries are authoritarians or don't share our values, it's going to make life very difficult for us in terms of our security, in terms of our economic interests. So I'm concerned, but hopeful.
Again, a great theme. But let's get to the why. I mean, what is driving this pattern that you described, Michael? I know Secretary Albright, you wrote a book not long ago entitled "Fascism: A Warning," and you've been a close observer of trends in the world. Obviously, it's complicated, but if you had to identify a couple of factors that really seem to be causing this trend, what would they be? And again, maybe I'll start with you, Madeleine.
Well, I think that this is not something that happened overnight. Part of the problem is that there are divisions in every society, mostly to do with economics, some place in society. And states were set up by what we call the social contract, where people gave up some of their individual rights in order to be protected by a government. And each side had its responsibilities, and frankly, both sides were not fulfilling their responsibilities. And I think more and more there began to be the economic divisions that probably are felt the most by people in terms of can they feed their families, can they do the things they want to do. And in my book, which is called Fascism: A Warning, I decided that I needed to go back and look at what actually had created authoritarian governments. Went back to Mussolini, who is the original fascist, but it also there was something that is, you can see in other places, is a feeling of the Italians at the time for lack of respect. They had been on the winning side of with the Allies in World War I, and nobody really kind of thanked them enough. And then there really were serious economic problems. And all of a sudden you get a demagogic leader who can exacerbate those divisions and align himself with one group at the expense of another, the scapegoats. So then that becomes the major split, and it then is exacerbated even more. And as we look at what is going on in a number of countries now, it is seen there. Hungary, for instance, was setting, quote, real Hungarians against those that were immigrants of some kind, and economically. Same thing is happening in the Philippines, Venezuela, etc. And it really is an exacerbation of economic differences that are then reign everything. And in the United States, that was happening also. And I think that it really is something that more divisions that are created. And one of the things that's so important, and Michael and I agree on everything, frankly, but I'm also chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute. And I have been saying for some time, democracy has to deliver because people want to eat and vote. And so the question is, how does democracy deliver on that promise to kind of deal with the domestic issues, the economic issues above all others?
Well, that's a great summary of what seem to be the driving factors. Michael, what Madeleine says you agree on everything. Perhaps said she's already said what you might say, but what would you add to that?
Well, I would be very cautious about disagreeing with the secretary, but I do happen to agree with her on what she just said. Let me mention three factors that I think about just to move the conversation along, and I will say that there are hundreds of books about this subject over the last 4 or 5 years, of which the fascism book that the secretary referred to is one of the best. But I think of three issues. I think one is, for the past 15 or 20 years, I think there's been a growing dissatisfaction, in some cases justifiable or not, with the status quo in the world. And this takes in different forms in different places. It can be dissatisfaction, as Secretary Albright said, with the delivery of economic results for peoples. It can be dissatisfaction with immigration and immigration policies. But I think that this kind of dissatisfaction has really led to an openness to really unscrupulous politicians to offer very simplistic and really not accurate, diagnoses to some of these problems. And I think we have to, it takes different forms in different places, but I certainly think that dissatisfaction is fueling this. Number two, I think the issue of technology. I'm a former journalist, and the world of technology and information is so different than it was 30 years ago. And the internet, which we had first really thought was going to be this instrument of liberation, has really, opened up amazing opportunities for the bad guys to restrict rights, to restrict freedoms. And you see that in places like our own country, where the ability to, disrupt elections has been on display for the last 2 election cycles. The final thing I would just put on the table is the role of China. This is a big one. I think if you look at the Freedom House reports, I think it's clear that China is probably the single biggest potential threat to liberty over the next generation. What's interesting about China, and disturbing, I would say, is that the country has done a very effective job of repressing its own people and really engaging in systematic persecution of minorities. But now it's increasingly willing to try to intimidate its critics overseas. I myself, along with Derek Mitchell, the head of NDI, was sanctioned by the Chinese, not for repressing rights, but for speaking up for the rights of people in China. So I think China is another issue, and their role in the world is going to be really crucial to the future story of democracy.
Well, that's a very helpful sort of enumeration of the issues we'll be talking about in the course of the summit over the next 2 days. A great introduction to the themes that we'll be talking about. We're talking about the sort of the state of democracy. It's a little bit of a gloomy picture, and the causes of that. I guess a question I would have is to what extent is authoritarianism contagious? I mean, are countries out there looking around at what's happening in other places and following suit? Or the corollary, of course, is to what extent is democracy contagious? To what extent does it matter what is happening in the U.S. or other democracies in terms of the impact on the world? Let me start with you, Michael, and then I'll come to Secretary Albright.
Well, I definitely think that authoritarianism and democracy are contagious. These things seem to move in waves. We're now, after a great period of democratization after World War II, we're now in a kind of downward cycle for democracy. I think what's interesting, if you study the authoritarian playbook, there are standard tools in the playbook. I mean, if you look at whether it's Putin or whether it's Erdogan or whether it's Maduro, there's a toolkit. They copy each other. So they stack the courts with their allies. They repress the independent press. They repress civil society. In some ways, they're not as violent as the dictators of the past, but they're very effectively, consolidating control, and they look at each other how they manage things. On the other side, I do think that, as you've seen in the popular protests over the last 2 years, democracy is also contagious.
Right.
As you alluded to, Fritz, there's still a demand for democracy, which is really something that's very gratifying and something to build on. And I think what's interesting is, the protesters in Belarus are kind of watching what the protesters in Hong Kong did and learning from each other. And I think that is what gives me hope. So I do think, the basic essence of your question, that this is kind of contagious. And so I hope that we're kind of going to be reaching soon the crest of the downward wave, and we'll start a new fourth wave of democratization quite soon.
Yeah. And Madeleine, is that how you see it as well? That it's this pattern of waves. Now people are looking around and seeing authoritarianism and stealing playbooks. But I guess the corollary is that democracy can also rebound and inspire other places.
Well, I agree, but I also think the following thing is that democracy is actually harder than it looks. We are proving that ourselves. And my specialty has always kind of been Central and Eastern Europe for the obvious reasons. And there was a sense that after the Cold War, that they would become democracies fairly quickly, and especially Czechoslovakia, because it had actually been a democracy. And just to kind of, I know that Mr. Rasmussen is also part of this. He and I have worked together on this when he was Secretary General of NATO, and I was the head of a group of experts for a new strategic concept for NATO. And we have to remember that NATO is a club of democracies, that is also part of it. And the question is to how that works when you've got Turkey and Hungary, who are not exactly at the moment, and neither are Poland. And so there are the conflicts there in terms of how democracy is really carried out. And then the authoritarians, they really are buddies. There's no question. They prod each other up. They don't criticize each other. A little bit of that was true in our last president. So I think that we need to understand that. I also think, and I'd like to return to this, Michael mentioned it, about the whole role of the media and news and technology. And technology is a two-edged sword in many different ways. It is a great gift, but at the same time, it can be misused by the kind of false information that gets into it, and how that is used to motivate. And so I think one of the questions that we all have to deal with is, how do we deal with the basic concept of democracy, which is freedom of the press, and at the same time as it gets misused by others, and how do you allow that kind of expression to go forward? I did, just again to show my kind of way that I look at things, I wrote my dissertation on the role of the Czechoslovak press in 1968 during the Prague Spring, because the role of the media in political change is very important and interesting. And how do people get, there are no such things as alternative facts. And I think that we need to sort out how we support and encourage the freedom of the press and not have it be misused by malign ways of technology these days. So both, but I do think democracy is contagious too. I really do. What bothers me is when we don't have enough exchanges of students, for instance, these days. And the way that young people really see what happens in different societies and that freedom of the exchange of views.
Well, there's you've introduced both of you so many themes that we'll be talking about, both the threats and the challenges, but also each of you sort of on the positive side, the possibility that democracy is also contagious, and signs of it around the world, this continuing hunger for democracy that we see in protests out there. We have such limited time here. I did want to take one or two questions from our audience while we, in the time we have remaining. So let me turn very quickly to those. Margaret Rogers from Boulder writes or asks, what would you say to young people who point to how effective China, most definitely not a democracy, has been so effective in controlling the COVID virus? And Madeleine, why don't I start with you?
Well, they launched it, so they have some responsibility for it. I do think that this is the problem. They can do lockdowns and people don't protest, frankly. And they will, if they tell them to wear masks, they wear masks. I do think, though, what is interesting, there are other countries that have been very good about controlling the virus, and they are democracies. New Zealand, Taiwan, Denmark, Germany, mostly countries that are run by women, by the way. But I really do think that the Chinese, first of all, we're not sure about their statistics, but I do think they can order people around in a way that democracies, it's a little harder.
Perhaps time for one more question. So Clayton, current student at the Corbell School, asked, what does the United States need to do in order to become an example and leader for other democracies once again? Why don't I start with you, Michael?
Well, that's a great question, and one that I've really been thinking about a lot in my 4 years at Freedom House. I don't think I really had as much of an appreciation of how absolutely crucial the United States is to the story of democracy. And I don't say this from a point of view of Pollyannishness. We know our history. We know that there's been slavery, Jim Crow, there have been serious foreign policy mistakes. But the truth of the matter is that the United States has tremendous founding ideals and principles, and we're in a constant struggle, really, to match those. And when the United States is not trying to meet those goals, those aspirations, I think it's really bad news for the story of democracy, because people really do look at what's happening here. We work with human rights activists all over the world. They pay close attention to what's happening in the United States. So it's really, really important for the United States to kind of model, good behavior. Let me just give you one stat that I always find interesting. We found in one of our reports a few years ago that dozens of countries, dictatorships really, had adopted the lexicon of fake news to justify censorship and attacks against journalists. And there's really only one reason that happened. It's because of the way that word has entered into our lexicon, sadly. And so I do think that people really pay attention to the United States. And I would say, if I had one thing for President Biden to say, he's had great, rhetoric about the need to kind of restore kind of democracy both at home and abroad, and we really hope he lives up to it.
That's great, Michael. And Madeleine, we have, in the 30 seconds we have left, you described your father and you coming to Denver and what that meant. What would you have to say about the importance of America as an example in the world?
Well, I think it is absolutely essential. And I do know, having been brought up by a man who understood what was happening in Europe and in the United States, is that the US has been the example when we came to America, we sailed by the Statue of Liberty. I will never forget that. And I do think that the fact that this country welcomed us here as refugees is something that was a sign of the real aspect of America, of being open and welcome and diverse. And we were, I described myself, I was asked to describe myself in 6 words recently. Worried optimist, problem solver, grateful American. And that is what I have learned, because we were so welcomed, by the way, in Denver at the court downtown. So, and Denver really symbolized the fact that we were welcome in this country and we're going to be able to contribute to it in some way. So gratitude. And it really is the major part. And the Corbell School is just a fantastic way to think about how to have the next generation understand the importance of that democracy is not a spectator sport. It is something that we all have to participate in.
Well, what a wonderful note to end on. I'm afraid we are out of time. Thank you so much, Secretary Albright, Michael Abramowitz, for a great conversation. And thank you, all of you in the audience, for being with us. Our next session on regional perspectives on democratic decline will begin shortly. Thank you all again very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And Michael, great to be with you.
Nice to see both of you. Thank you, Fritz, and thank you, Secretary Albright.